Hello, everyone. Oh, now we're live. Sorry, everyone, for the delay. Let's give it a second so we can see it. I can see it in the group now. Can anybody hear me? I can see looks like we have a couple people that are watching. I wanted to introduce myself to start. I'm Anissa, and I am run Hadrian's Wall Explorers. And we are so lucky today to have Alan Woods here with us. He is a volunteer tour guide at Housesteads Roman Fort, which is one of the biggest attractions that you will see along the wall. But when you do your walk on Hadrian's Wall, if you're like me and not the fastest walker, you might not have very much time or energy to really explore the fort and learn about it as much as you would like when you're there. You probably won't have time to go on one of Alan's tours because they do take time because there is so much information. Alan and I have spent a couple hours together trying to figure out how we could get all the information that he has into a concise presentation. And the answer is there's just too much information. So that's why we have decided to put it into different parts. I think it's probably going to be three parts. We'll see how things go. But I guess I want to turn it over to Alan. He can tell us a little bit more about himself and what we can expect during the presentation today.
Okay, thanks. I'll now share my screen, and hopefully everything will be hunky-dory. Uh, okay, got to attend. A request has been sent to it for you to allow screen sharing.
Oh, thank you for telling me. There we go.
Okay, we'll just share this bit. Okay, you should be able to see now the slide deck. Two images on the right-hand side, as far as I can see. One's me at the top, and the other one's Anissa. Okay, can you see it?
Yes, now I can see it.
Okay, excellent. It's a long way to walk from America back to England and so on and so forth. Okay,
Yes, now I.
uh, the aim of the presentation, or about the presentation, is about Housesteads. It's the fort I do my tour guiding on. It's been by PowerPoint. There are quite a lot of slides, but we're only going to go through a few because, as Anis has already said, once you start to learn about the wall and the forts and all the rest of it, there is just so much, it's just unreal.
Oh, one thing, Alan, before you get started, I think I forgot to mention that if people do have questions, they should type them in the Facebook chat. I'm going to be keeping an eye on the chat. So if you see me not looking right at the screen, I'm looking at the Facebook chat. So I'll interrupt Alan and get answers for any questions that people have.
Yeah, it is a matter of, just to reinforce that, please ask questions. That I would like it to be more of a conversation than me blathering for whatever, or blathering aimlessly. So please ask questions. Okay, first of all, a little bit of an introduction about me. The picture to my left is one my wife generated. We do own a spaniel, and we have been up to Sycamore Gap. I do look like Tom Cruise is going to look like in about 20 years' time. He, of course, is terrified. I've been in defense, UK defense all my working life. And I now, like I say, I'd like you to work up on Housesteads during the season, which is from March till October, doing tours, volunteer touring, tour guiding for people from all over the world, really. It's an absolute blast once you sort of get into it. The aim of the presentation, this is one of a series of slide decks associated with the wall and guiding and have you started to put together 2 years ago. initially it was for helping to train other guides, because when I signed up as a guide, I got about 3 bits of A4 paper and a little book. And then I found myself in a world of wonderful knowledge to gather. So this is the summation, if you like, of the slide decks are there. But it's based on Housesteads Fort rather than walking the wall. Okay. The idea is that Housesteads is the heart of the wall. And if you look on a map, and we'll go through a maps briefly in a little while, it is about the most central fort. It's one of the highest. It's also described as the best preserved fort on the wall, and that is because the archaeology that has been done over the last 150 years, 200 years thereabout, involved different forms of archaeological technique, different kinds of archaeologists, all with the same intent of recognizing the Hadrian's Wall for what it is, in other words, a remarkable piece of history in Britain, and wanting to preserve it. Okay. And as I say, this is an overview to Housesteads, the world in which it worked in, and hopefully a little bit later on in a session about the soldiers, the civilians who worked around it, and what have you. One thing I would like to just raise at this point is this. When I first started working the wall, for want of a better phrase, one of the things that struck me was that very little has changed in the way that the Romans ran a garrison, and the British Army runs a garrison, the American Army runs a garrison, and so forth, so on and so forth. Nothing much has changed, and most soldiers, when they get up there and it starts to describe them, settle and understand what's going on by virtue of the fact that in their barracks and their garrisons around the world, they've all got the same kind of thing, the same kind of building, same kind of that, this, that, the other. All right, Housesteads, as I said, it's the heart of the wall, central. It sits on Housesteads Cracks. When you get up to the north part of the fort, along here, it has some of the most stunning views across Cumbria and Northumberland. For me, it's just beautiful. The only drawback is it's got its own microclimate, and it can be nice and sunny down in the car park, but low in a hoolie when you get up to the fort. And it's just one of them things. It's an absolute blast, just watching people's reaction as they're walking up. As again, it is one of the more well-preserved. The fort is described as robbed out, however. Now, what that means is that over the centuries, a couple of centuries, everything that can be found, or the archaeologists think can be found, has been found. So the main statuary and all that. There will be other stuff, but it's described as robbed out on the basis that it's a term that archaeologists use, apparently, to suggest that there isn't much else left to find. And as you look at just this picture here, on the left, lower left, you can see the impact of various forms of archaeological approach by virtue of the fact that there are buildings above the ground, and there are buildings that have been dug up or excavated and have been reburied to preserve them. Okay. A lot of the finds that were in the fort, some of them are in the small museum, the English Heritage Museum, off to the west of the fort. But many of them are in places like Newcastle, Chester's Fort, that's down to John Clayton, a very clever man, one way or another. But it is as it is, and you can see the difference between the way it might have been when the Romans, the auxiliary soldiers here, and the way it is now, pretty much. Okay. Like I said, once you learn about it, and it's a matter of joining dots, it is a microcosm pretty much of the way the Roman Empire worked. Certainly not as big as emperors, but having said that, we did have an emperor here, Pertinax. But the way the town works, the way the fort works within the context of the area that it's in and all the rest of it, what you find very quickly once you start to research it, it literally does reach out across the empire, across the emperors and all the rest, because they all had a hand in this once the war was built. Each emperor contributed to it. Each emperor did this and that and the other, and the same the way back. The lines of communication between Rome and, say, somewhere like Hellas were actually very efficient and very uncomplicated. We're going to divide the deck's divided into these sections. Okay, just take a look. Incidentally, I posted a document, which is a copy of the slide deck. It's on the Facebook channel. Please feel free to download it, use it how you wish. But there's quite a few sections, but we're going to try and cover just these four this afternoon rather. Okay, the first bit, a timeline. Now, one of the way I try to explain the timeline is something like this. If you consider that the Romans came to Britain on the invasion in 43 AD, they left about 410, and that's about 400 years. And to give you an idea of the scope and scale of the history that's involved in 400 years, we're in 2025 now. If you go back, say, 400 or 500 years now, you won't be far off from the time when the Pilgrim Fathers set off to go to America to set off the 13 colonies. And you all know how much history there is just in the setting up of the US. Okay, this fort and the wall and the Roman invasion and so on have just as much a scale and scope of history, which is why it's very difficult, as far as I'm concerned, to be able to cover everything and for everybody to be an expert in everything. Because again, one of the things you find when you research the wall is that there are people who know so much it's unreal, but about very specific things. I am, if anything, a generalist. Now, again, it's a matter for me of just going through the timeline, quickly picking up a few key events. Julius Caesar had his go at invading. I came, I saw, I conquered. I thought it sucked. I went home again, which is the bit that Shakespeare left out. Augustus thought about invading Britain, but for whatever reason, things going on elsewhere, like the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, he decided not to. There was Caligula, Gaius, the Emperor Gaius. He sort of tried to invade. He got as far as Boulogne. And then for one reason or another, according to Tacitus and Suetonius, who are not too keen about him, he basically withdrew and so on. And therein you've got a whole pile of interesting stories about Caligula. It was Claudius who, because of political shenanigans in the UK at the time, was asked by one of his allies in Britain. And again, one of the more curious things that people think that the Romans didn't know much about Britain, but once you research it, you find out that there was extensive trade between Britain and Spain and Gaul and what have you, that the Romans were well aware of. But Claudius, one of the tribes on the south of Britain, on the south coast of Britain near Kent, Verica was the name of the chieftain, got himself into a bit of political trouble, and he was basically deposed by the tribes to the north, the Cantavillani. And what he did was he wrote to Claudius and said, hang on a minute, help. I need somebody to come and get me, to bail me out and have you. And Claudius, not the most military of emperors, needed something to display his military capability, his military skills. And the emperor, the invasion of Britain presented just such an opportunity to do that. So we invaded in 43. Then there was the Battle of Medway, interesting in its own right because it exposed, or rather revealed to the Brits the way the Roman cavalry worked, amongst other things, which was a total surprise, and so on. There was then, not long after, the capture of what became Camalodunum, which is now Colchester, which became the first, if you like, Roman capital of Britain. But there was two threads to the invasion, which I'll explain a little bit later on. The tribes were disarmed, and most of and that came because something of a problem for the tribes generally, because part of that disarming obviously was removing of weapons. And one of the cultural things about the change that brought about was that carrying a weapon as a young man in the tribes, not just in Britain but elsewhere, was kind of a rite of passage. And that caused all kinds of ructions all by itself. Okay, around about 48, first stage conquest was complete. As I say, Colchester was formed, Camalodunum was formed, became Colchester. Caractacus, one of the more famous chieftains, Inside his sort of backstory is something like off of Dallas or Coronation Street. He fought on. He was defeated. He legged it up to one of the northern tribes and then was handed over by a lady called Cartamandua to Claudius, who Claudius immediately took him back to Rome as a prisoner when he kept him there forever and ever. Amen. From there on in, it becomes a tale of revolt and uh, gradual conquest. There's the Boudiccan revolt, which I don't doubt many of you will have heard of. But there was periodically, about every 20, 30 years, there was something going on that meant violence, battle, and all the rest of it. One of the other great impacts of the on the invasion of Britain was the Great Revolt in Judea. And what that brought about was one of the legions was withdrawn and formed part of the army that went into Judea to put the Jewish rebellion down. And the Jewish rebellion, again, is another story of Romans not quite conquering everything in the way that they are portrayed as doing it. Then we have movement north, rise of and the construction of places like York. Then you have as part of as the Roman Empire stabilized, sort of um, uh, gained authority, if you like. The changes that came along were not just merely military or to do with treasure or gold or anything like that. It became cultural changes. And one of those indications of cultural change is the rise of the VAT. And one of the biggest in Britain, in fact, the biggest in Britain, is a place called Fishbourne Palace. If you want to look up something as a piece of wonderful Roman building in Britain, and that is definitely the place to go. It's to the south of England, just to the north of the Isle of Wight. It was built by oh, we go. I can't have trouble with the pronunciation of these things. Cogidubnus. And it really is a magnificent building to go and see if you've got the time when you're in the UK. Roman London started to enlarge, and the emphasis in terms of government administration shifted from Colchester and went down to London, and so on. At one point, the Brigantes were conquered, the northern tribes, one of the last of the northern tribes. And there was one of the governors called Agricola, and what he decided to do was he would finish off the conquest of Britain and march north. He basically marched up the east coast of Scotland. What you find when you study all of these movements and the gradual, the nature of the conquest, they are all what are termed all arms operations. So he needed naval support and so on. But eventually he took most of Scotland, I think it's fair to say. There was a battle at Mons Gropius, which is famous for, or rather important for the Housesteads fort, because the soldiers that were garrisoned there were one of the victorious cohorts in that battle. And in that battle, basically, it's reported that Agricola drew his army up in three lines with the auxiliary in the front. And being a bit flippant, he said he could see the tribes up on the glen. And he said, "Right, lads, away you go and get them," or words to that effect. And then in the ensuing battle, for the want of 300 deaths in the Roman army, something an estimated 30,000 Scots were put to the sword. And part of the story of the invasion is the tactical advantage that the Romans had over the tribes. The tribes just didn't know how to fight something as well organized as the Roman army. Another little bit of niff-naff and trivia is the major road network is estimated to have been completed around AD 100. What that did was gave them a speed of communication, which is quite extraordinary once you begin to understand the nature of things like the Cursus Publicus, the post office, and that kind of thing, and how all these things joined up. Okay, it wasn't just a war. It wasn't just the Roman army. It was a whole government infrastructure, much of which you would recognize now in any modern sort of society. Okay. Something happened in around about 117. Oh, sorry. Trajan was died. He was the emperor before Hadrian, and Hadrian was totally different in his attitude to life compared to Trajan. And Trajan was the last of the conquering emperors. Hadrian was a consolidator. Again, to be a little bit flippant to describe it, one of the things that happened was he kind of said, right, not enough, too much empire and not enough soldiers. We'll start to build the borders. What he did was he built a series of limes or limites or border lines, but he built them across the empire. So there's one reaching from the north coast of Britain right the way down through the Danube to Iran, Persia. There was another one that went all the way around Judea, and then another one even longer than across North Africa. Just that is remarkable, just for that one bloke. Aside from anything else, just building those borders, just an amazing thing to do. And arguably, the last of those borderlines was Hadrian's Wall up in Britain, and he was the part of the backstory to that is something happened in Britain up round where Agricola eventually formed his boundary. And it was some kind of military defeat for the Romans. And Hadrian, as a reaction to that, came across to Britain and said, took a long recce all the way around the place, around 120. He commissioned the wall and then cleared off. And the wall took about 10 years to build if you include the forts. All right. So the wall was finished around about 132, 134, something like that. And that includes the forts. So building the wall itself was 7 years, but it was 3 years to build the forts and so on. There was another revolt in Judea. Again, it's a recurring thing. And with that, what happened was, again, part of the army in Britain, because the army in Britain, the Roman army in Britain was between 4 and 6 legions at any one time, which was a significant chunk of the whole Roman army. So again, part of the Roman army, part of the army in Britain withdrew and went to fight with the Barbarossa in Judea, and there were other wars and battles elsewhere. Okay, so that's a very quick gallop through a couple of 100 years worth of history. Again, I can't stress enough about just how much has crammed into those couple of bits of sentences. It's just incredible. As I've started to study it, it amazes me the amount of stuff people know. So, for instance, I now have a list of soldiers who served in Hadrian's army. I know a little bit about their career history in Segedunum, at Wall's End. There is a fort there, and what there is the bit of statuary, which is a big, huge stone which contains the names of the centurions who built the wall. And if you check them out and check those lists out, then actually we've got quite a lot of record of what they actually did to construct the wall and so on and so forth. It's just unreal. Okay, a little bit about why the wall was built. Again, it becomes a matter of just how well organized the Romans were, certainly in the way they ran a government. Now, that building to the left, on the left-hand side, the image here, is something called the Tabularium. It's not far from the Vatican, St. Peter's Square, and what have you. You can see it if you look carefully, as you look away from St. Peter's Square. Now, the Tabularium was, if you like, akin to the Public Records Office, Somerset House in the UK or wherever the US equivalent is. And I think it's fair to say that just about everything to do with the running of Rome that needed documenting, copies of it ended up there. So, for instance, the soldiers, our auxiliaries, when they did the 25 years or whatever it was, providing they got an honourable discharge, they got a certificate, a discharge plaque, which did a number of things. It gave them citizenship of Rome and so on and so forth. and they're free to live anywhere they liked in the empire. But what also happened was a copy of that discharge certificate or the military record of the soldier on discharge would end up back at the Tealarium at some point. All of that, all by itself, was remarkable, considering nobody else was actually doing anything that, and nobody else in Europe was doing anything like that. So there was at one point quite a lot of documentation, which is again one of the reasons why we know quite so much as we know about the way the Roman army and the Roman Empire worked. Okay. We know as well because of things like the Antonine inventory and a book which is quite funny when you get to look at it called the Notitia Dignitatum. One of the things that civil servants like to do the world over is catalogue stuff. And both of those, the Antonine inventory and the document digitatum, are just catalogues of what the empire was looking like on a particular day when they'd finished the documents. Now, if you look at them and you download copies, because there are copies knocking around, one of them, the Notitia, is quite funny because you find there's lists, reams and reams of lists of places and key governors, key generals, and all the rest who were in place and so on and so forth. But what you can see when you look at it is there's loads of scribblings out. And basically, what I reckon will have happened is the guys who were tasked with writing these documents will have got them, written them all out, handed them over to the emperor, and the emperor and his close staff would have gone, "Oh no, that's wrong," and started scribbling off all over the place. We also get from the Notitia Dignitatum one of the names for Housesteads, which I'll come back to later on. But it is a matter of the Romans had records, a public records office, and they had an awful lot of detail. Unfortunately for us, most of it has gone walkabout, lost in the various sieges and what have you. But just be aware that the Roman invasion of Britain was not by any stretch of the imagination just about military conquest. Okay, the other name that's popular for Housesteads is Vercovicium. If you actually come to the fort, and please do, it's just fabulous when you get up there on a sunny day. It's not so cool on a 4-7 gale, but nevertheless. The name Vercovicium has got a number of translations. One of them is sleep plate. When you get up there, you can see that. And if you look at Anissa's screenshot behind her, that's typical of the wall of the area of the fort that Housesteads is in. That Housesteads is in. The other name for it is Place of Able Fighters. Now, that is, as far as I'm concerned, a compliment to the soldiers that were stationed there for the longest period. Now, the longest period would have been about 150, 200 years. Belgians garrisoned in the fort. Initially completely Belgian, but it would have sort of graded over years because moving soldiers across from Belgium or recruiting soldiers was a little bit more difficult than as you can imagine. Our soldiers were very good at fighting. Amongst other things, they're credited with being one of the cohorts that rescued the infamous Ninth Legion, Legio Hispana, when Agricola invaded North. They were ambushed at night by the Scots, and it was the Tungrians that helped rescue them. They were also one of the cohorts that fought at Mons Gropius. Now, they were highly competent soldiers, of that I have no doubt. When you get to understand the nature of their kit and the way the Roman army worked and all that kind of thing, they were fit young men, hard. The way I tried to explain it when on tour my tours is, I ask people what's the furthest they've ever walked on a day, and some say 20 miles or whatever it is, it doesn't matter. I then ask how much carried in weight. And when you mention that, it starts gives the idea, because they were carrying 65-pounder kit. All day, every day they could do that, marching up and down all over the place and fight at the end of it. Amazing people, amazing. Again, coming back to this ability to keep records and what have you, one of the things that key was a guy, the censor. And the censor was key because what he would do was he'd keep track of who was living where, even down to individuals if necessary. And of that comes taxation and so much besides. And again, it all affected Housesteads and everywhere else for no other reason that there are a number of inscriptions or pieces of document that were found, that have been found, to the effect that at one stage, Housesteads as a fort, it's got a small town outside of it, but that town achieved local government status, if you like, and it too would have been formed, would have taken part in the census. And to the south gate of the fort, there is a sort of round, half-shaped building or brick wall, and that was the home of the governor's representative on the fort. So again, part of the maturity of the fort was the Roman army would have run it first. The vicars would have sprung up to supply goods and soldiers, but eventually the town was given its local government status, and eventually became a local government area for the area around the fort, however much that was. So again, it was not, to stress, it was not just a military occupation and a military invasion. Okay, the wall itself. After what Agrippa north, in 83 AD, he was obliged to return. One of the things about Tacitus is that when Agrippa went north, he said that he would finish the conquest of Britain off. He also had visions of going across to Ireland. He reckoned he only needed one lead to do that. But something happened elsewhere, and a big chunk of his army had to go and help. And basically, Agrippa was given no choice. He had to withdraw. Now, what he did was he withdrew to what is called the Stangate line. Okay, and you can see the Stangate from Housesteads Fort. It's basically a straight line carved across the country. But he withdrew, built Stangate, and a number of forts associated with it. So Corbridge, Vindelander, etc. Now, again, I've mentioned it before, but in around about 115, between 115 and 120, which brought Hadrian across, something happened. Tacitus again describes the idea that, as does Cassius Dio, that there were lots of losses in the Roman army in Britain at the time, and Britain had become almost ungovernable. Again, Hadrian came across, and what he did was he made a major change, not just in the wall, but in the nature or the structure of the garrison of Britain. So he brought across the 6th Legion, and then another of the wonderful bits of the history of the wall, the legion that was in York at the time, the 9th Legion, was pulled out. Now, just that has generated all kinds of excitement and mystery, because there's no documentation to say why the 9th Legion pulled out. When I was a young lad, one of the bits about it is that The Eagle of the Ninth, a film you'll have seen, and a book by Rosemary Sutcliffe, said that they marched off into Scotland and just disappeared. And Arab has become another little bit of tale of mystery and imagination about the history of fort if you want to study it. I should say that in the slides and in the documents, if you get them, all these bits with a blue underline and all the rest, if you click on them, it will go back to an authoritative website and something to do with each of the units or wherever the link fits. Now, again, it was commissioned, the wall was commissioned as part of the limites and what have you, the borders. It was a political statement, first of all. Here be Rome. It would have been imposing in its day. When you look at the way the wall was built, there were different thicknesses along the length of the wall. There were different heights. There were different forts were built differently, and so they're not differently, but built in different places to dominate the land and so on and so forth. Okay, but what the principal point of Hadrian's Wall was that it was a political statement that said, south of here is Rome, Roman Empire. North of there, we're not quite sure what's going on. We'd rather not know, but we've got to trade with you and you'll be our game. So it's here be Rome, a bold, absolute, direct, in-your-face statement, which, of course, the tribes to the north didn't like particularly. It became a customs and excise point, if you like. And you can see the impact again through the south gate. You look into the south gate and you look at the floor of the south gate, you can see ruts into the south gate. You can see the same ruts on the east gate. The north gate's been closed off again a thousand or so years ago. But you've got a clear indication that it was used as a checkpoint to do customs and excise. And part of the Roman taxation system was to do with import and export taxes. So all that going on inside the fort, again, not just the military bit. Again, all of that meant the establishment of a permanent force, a permanent garrison. And when you look at the nature of the garrison, it's quite remarkable because the Roman Empire stretched across North Africa, stretched around Judea, stretched across Europe. And the garrison was made of auxiliaries which came from pretty much all over the empire. Now, there's one of the forts towards Maryport, which had a blue plaque. And the blue plaque commemorates the Roman legion that was there, and it's the first coloured regiment of soldiers that ever hit Britain. Okay. Soldiers were Belgians. The fort just down the road, Chester's, was a Spanish cavalry. There were Dacians, Romanians in Red Oswald and so on. So what the fort was, what the forts were and the wall was, the garrison came from across the empire, and it was a polyglot population grouping of everyone from across the empire with a common language, basically, because at that time Dacians couldn't talk Scouse, etc., etc., etc. But Latin was a kind of common language. But they came across the whole of the empire. Now, again, if you look at the way the nature of the way our Tungrians were recruited, it goes something like this. There had been Tongres is a region of Belgium, sort of Belgian-German border nowadays. There had been some kind of fight between the Romans and the Tungrians. And what the Romans usually often did was, if there was a particular set of military skills that another bunch of people had that they could, they'd say to them, "Can we have some of your young lads, please? Join our army and become auxiliaries." Now, the way they did it with the Tungrians was, it was, I think, it was Cerealis, presented them with a fait accompli and said, "Look, you come and send some of your young lads to join our army, and we won't tax you to the chieftains." And the chieftains then went something like, "Oh yeah, good idea. Away you go, lads, ta-ra." And then they were shipped across. Now, that too is part of the nature of control that the Romans applied, because what it meant was they were shipping off a whole bunch of fit young men, very aggressive soldiers, and they shipped them as far away as possible from where they came from, in this case, Hadrian's Wall. Now, they did the same with the same kind of the three cohorts of Brits that were recruited. They shipped them off to Romania. So what you then had was an awful lot of the young population, the young aggressive population, being shifted around to protect border areas of the Roman Empire. I just think that's clever all by itself. Okay. What also happened was, in the military, what they talk about is they say things like, the soldiers talk about tactics and war fighting and all the rest of it, but the professionals talk about logistics. And that is particularly true about the Romans. Their logistics management, their logistics system was simply brilliant for the time. Now, if you suddenly put 1,000 bucks in the middle of nowhere and make them live in a fort, then a number of things usually happen. First of all, you've got to feed them and clothe them and heat them and all the rest of it. So you've got that kind of infrastructure inside the fort that needs to be there as well, and it is. But what also happens is that the local population, because the Roman soldiers were paid in a currency that could be exchanged pretty much across the empire, that attracted tradesmen and special skills suppliers and all the rest to go and live near where the money was. And the basic economics of it is that the Roman soldiers were being paid, everyone else wasn't. So if you wanted to make some money quick off the Romans that you could spend anywhere, then what you go and do is work for the Roman garrison one way or the other. And inside each or outside each of the town, each of the forts, you have what's called a vicus. Okay, there are other words, so there's depending on the size, but the vicus will do for Housesteads. And inside or on the in the vicus, there were all kinds of people supplying goods and services. There were also soldiers who would finish their 25 years and settle. Now, the problem that generated for the soldiers goes something like this. If you joined the Roman army as an auxiliary or as a legionary, you signed up for 25 years. Okay, that was your commitment. You get your 3 square, you get paid, you'd also get looked for medically and so on and so forth. But it's 25 years. Now, the average life expectancy during that period, and I'm talking about the years 43 to about 150, was about 27. Now, there are all kinds of reasons for that happening, but if your life expectancy is 27 years, is just 27 years old, you join the army, then actually all your life potentially is going to be in the army or what have you. Now, let's just say you made it out to your 25 years and you were a young Belgian soldier when you joined the army. As an old Belgian soldier, you'd have difficulties getting back to Belgium because the Romans wouldn't pay to go to send you back. But also when you got there, you wouldn't actually know anybody because everyone had just snuffed it. So it's a case then of what would happen is, again, part of the if you like, cultural change the Romans built was that the soldiers were settled locally. Again, it is a matter of some of these settled locally actually became quite large lots of soldiers given being grants of land. And that too was often a trigger for anger amongst the local population because the Romans were displacing them by virtue of the fact they'd been given the land, etc., etc., etc. So what you had then is towns grew, and part of the cultural change was that those towns would supply goods and services to the soldiers in the forts. And if you ever go near a garrison town anywhere, you'll see the same thing going on now. So again, that kind of social change, it was not just the military bit.
So how
Okay,
old would people be when they would join the army?
okay. Now, there is a book. I'll just wave it in front of my face. Um, it's called De Re Militari. It's by a guy called Vegetius. I won't go into much detail about it, except that Vegetius basically is a somebody who was an armchair general, for want of a better phrase, whinging about the way the army should run. And he sets out some clear conditions about recruitment of young soldiers. Basically, young, fit countrymen. He wasn't particularly enamored of the guys who lived in the city because he thought they were a bit soft. But again, anything the young and fit bit is where it gets murky when you consider that there were no such things as birth certificates and all the rest of it. But to join an auxiliary regiment, if you look big enough and ugly enough, and you could convince the centurion who was doing the recruiting that you were big enough and ugly enough, you were in, or you could apply. So anything from say 16 on. Okay. Now, again, it becomes a matter of it would be on average, it'd have been about 18 to 21, I reckon. But again, they'd sign up for 25 years. And they'd come out, if they did that, at around about 42, 43, thereabouts. And again, the issue then is where do they go once they're finished? So they settle locally, etc., etc., etc. Okay. And inside and outside Housesteads, again, there is all kinds of bits and pieces of buildings and what have you, which we'll come to another time. But one of them I describe as Burgerus Kingus, because the Romans did fast food. Amongst other things, there were no kitchens in a lot of Roman houses and so on. So they had to go out and buy cooked food from suppliers. There was all of that kind of thing going on. You had a bustling town of people plus the garrison. And all of that kind of thing attracted people and so on and so forth. But it also brought in the need for civil administration. It also introduced the idea of taxation and so on, because amongst other things, the army had to be paid for. Okay. I can't stress it enough. The long-term benefit of all of this for the Romans was to establish their cultural supremacy. Okay, you had the military presence, but you also built, what also happened was there would be an economic and industrial dependency on them by virtue of the fact, amongst other things, that they were the only ones who knew how to make roof tiles, for instance. The Roman army had no on mining across the empire, so mining for gold, silver, anything really. The Roman army owned the land, if you like, or the emperor owned the land. All of that kind of thing, all driven by the nature of the army's presence in Britain and elsewhere across the empire. Okay, a little bit of a break. Anyone got any questions?
I don't see any questions in the comments, but guys, if you have any questions about anything that Alan has covered so far, you can go ahead and just type it in the comments. I have my eye kind of on that at any time. Well, we
Okay.
did, someone did give us a like, so that's a good sign.
That's one of my subplots is to teach the whole world Scouse. So you'll have to bear with. And the other thing I do is colour it with a little bit of British military humour from time to time. So if I suddenly swear or something like that, it's me lapsing into what I was. Okay, what I'm going to try and do now is describe the lay of the land. Not necessarily the ground, but so much as the geopolitics of it all. Okay. Now, it was about a 50-year invasion, and there were clear stages to it, which if you choose to study it, you'll see something like this that I'm about to describe. The first stage, the landing at Richborough, the advance west, and the advance west is important because of the name Vespasian, who became one of the more significant emperors. Once you read about him, as far as I'm concerned, he's a bloody clever man, but he's also strongly influential in the way that the Roman Empire shaped up in Britain. Then, advance north, a bit of consolidation. And you'll notice that the lines tend to be drawn across thing, but close to where there are ports, what have you. And what would happen is at both ends, there would be permanent forts built, the legionary forts, big things, huge things. But that was part of the gradual expansion or the gradual move north. During the second stage, up to about 60, there was the Boudicca Rebellion and so on. Then there was the advance to the Humber and the Dee. Okay, and that included finalizing the conquest of Wales and so on. And again, another period of stabilization along that line, the Humber Dee line, because they didn't want to go on and take on the Brigantes further north and out to Mandia or what have you. Eventually, conquest of Brigantia. The founding, there's some debate about who actually found Carlisle, for instance, how far north they go, who did this and who did that. But basically, as far as the conquest of Brigantia, and that basically conquered Britain as far as it would be, if you like, a sort of preliminary boundary between England and Scotland, but not quite where the boundary is now. Then there was the invasion of Agricola up to Scotland, right the way up, right the way around, etc., etc., etc. And as I said earlier on, considering invading Ireland. And then something happened. They had to consolidate, and they consolidated along what's called the Stangate Line. All right. The Stangate Line was a road, basically, with a number of forts along it, pretty much the same as Hadrian's Wall, but without the wall, if that makes sense. Okay, so the Stangate Line was a bit of stabilization. And then something happened, as I mentioned before. we don't know what happened precisely, and that's part of this. One of the issues with the story of the conquest of Britain is that first of all, the Brits didn't write anything down, so we haven't got the British side of it. And secondly, much has been lost. So we don't know for definite whether anything I have told you is precisely the way I've told you. Please don't take it as I'm teaching you, telling you gospel. It is to say that we know uh, something happened between 84 and 120 that brought Hadrian across, and that led to the commissioning of the wall, etc. At least there are reports, I think it's in Tacitus, something to the effect that a general was killed, a Roman general, a legate or something like that. But nevertheless, during that period, something major happened. As I mentioned before, the Legio IX Hispana left Britain and were replaced by the Sixth Victrix. So you had several stages. But again, it was all about this map. If you're looking at it, you all of the stages and what have you, the lines with the governors and all that kind of stuff and the way they conquered. A word about the governors. The governors were polymaths, very clever men by and large. Some of them were cleverer than others. One of them, a chap called Frontinus, he was responsible for the conquest or the final conquest of Wales. But the idea of the governors coming here on an operational tour, if you like, they do 2 years, and then they go back to Rome to do something else. Now, Frontinus's particular thing was he, in his younger days, he did something remarkable. He worked with the soldiers who did things like surveying and all the rest. And there weren't manuals, but what he did was started writing things down about the way they worked and the way they explained things. Now, out of that came basically the Roman manual of building stuff written down, or the Roman manual of the way the Roman army builds stuff. And part of that is how they value land, which is quite fascinating in its own right. In any event, when Frontinus finished, there is some debate about how far north Frontinus went. There is part of the debate is to do with Carlisle, which is just down the road from where I live, where they say it was either Frontinus or Cerealis who set up Carlisle. And at the moment, there's a big dig going on in Carlisle to do with, and one of the things they hope to be able to establish which one of them it was and whether Hadrian came. But you had all of that kind of thing going on. Anyway, Frontinus finished his 2-year tour. He went back to Rome and he did some other soldiery things, but eventually he was appointed to be the person who was responsible for the construction and maintenance of the aqueducts in Rome and the sewers in Rome and all that kind of thing. So he was a highly skilled water engineer in his own right. And I've got a book somewhere which I'll just wave at you. Oops. This is a little gem. It's out of print and all the rest of it. It's called Roman Surveyors. It is remarkable by virtue of the fact that the manuals that Frontinus wrote and other key military surveyors became the, if you like, the de facto standard operating procedures for surveyors and aqueduct building in Europe for about the next 1,000 years. And indeed, this one, okay, the De Re Militari was a military manual that was carried by Richard the Lionheart, apparently, Henry II, right the way through by generals up until I think 1770 is the last I've been able to find. So all of these books and all of these stuff that were influential in Europe for 1,000 years after they'd long gone.
So
Okay.
maybe after the presentation, you can put the details of those books in the group because I'm not sure people were able to get that from the
inside the slide deck, which are published. The second to last slide is list contains a lot of the books
Okay.
and guides and bits and pieces that I think will be useful. Okay, in any event, the last slide in this deck has got my email address. If anyone wants to get in touch with us and ask any questions, just drop us an email. Okay, maps now. If a picture paints the picture tells 1,000 words, or this thing does it in spades. So it's an ordnance survey map of Roman Britain. I'm just going to go through two views of it. Okay. This is Deer Street. This green line here stretches off. You can't see it, you can't walk it in places and all the rest of it. But basically, it's one of the main roads from Corbridge, actually south down to Watling Street and what have you. Deer Street goes up into Scotland. So that road was built and what have you. Then have the wall. Okay. With Housesteads and other forts along indicated along it. It's a fascinating map. However, what it also illustrates is the nature of forts built north of the wall, because there were loads of them. And one of them is called Castra Exploratum. It's near a place called Netherley Hall. And one of the interesting things about it was the Romans had their own form of special forces. There were several classes of them. One of them was speculators. My Latin pronunciation is rubbish, but they were equivalent, if you like, of SEALs, Green Berets, and all of that kind of thing. Their job was to recce and keep an eye on what the Scots were doing. Okay. There was also an auxiliary infantry corps there and what have you. But the idea was that a number of forts were built north of the wall, even from Agricola's time, to keep an eye on what the Scots were up to. Okay. Next bit, the geopolitics, the tribes. Okay. The wall itself was built within Roman territory. Okay, so to the south of the Briganti border. If you like an analogy of that is the nature of the Iron Curtain that was built in Europe. It was actually built inside the East German boundary. So that principle of building boundaries and hard borders inside your own land so you can do it is a well-established principle. The tribes, the Brigantes down to the south, the map is marked with Corvetii, but basically they were, if you like, a sub-clan of the Brigantes. The Votadini, off to the east coast of Scotland, the Sugavai in the middle, and the Novantai to the west coast. Now, just those three tribes illustrate the nature of the political situation the Romans found themselves in. So with the Votadini, they were pragmatic and basically said, right, we can't do anything about these Romans, so we'll get on with them. So Deer Street, up that way, strayed into their land and what have you, and they lived with the Romans. There were the occasional punch between the Votadini and what have you. The Selgavai and then over Novantai, rather, roughly, and I'm probably being a bit from 30 or so years, they'd have a rebellion against the wall, trying to attack it or something like that. And one of the great sieges of the Roman Empire in Britain is at Burns Hill, and that's in Dumfries and Galloway. And if you get the chance to go up there, go and have a look. Basically, what they did was there was a hill fort, an Orpidia, and the Romans basically surrounded it. They built a fort of their own to the north and the south, and then fenced it off or whatever it was. And then they did the equivalent of shelling it with artillery. Now, their artillery was not like big bang things, but it was catapults and Scorpios, crossbows. But one of the things they found at Burns Walk, which illustrated the nature of the efficiency of Roman artillery, was a couple of thousand crossbow bolts, for want of a better phrase, or an auger rounds. But what had happened was they'd been drilled through, and what that meant was as they went through the air, they kind of went meow. So the sound, this bit of psychological warfare was also built into the nature of the siege. So all that kind of thing was going on. It wasn't just the soldiers marching along with their spears and gladii and all the rest of it. It was an all-arms exercise, and that's just one other indication, as is the nature of the ships and all the rest and the naval support the coast of Britain. Taking a step lower down the level of detail, because when you use maps, you don't just use a map, you use multiples and overlay, if you like. And in one of the slide packs I've done, I've got a little overlay exercise which explains how to do it. But in this is an ordnance survey from a sheet called OL43. If you are going to walk the wall, then please buy the map. The reason is if you get lost, the map will get you out of it, as well as a good compass. Please do not underestimate the nature of the remoteness of the wall into modern Britain. It really is out in the Ulu. But an ordnance survey map looks something like this. Once you get to practice how to use it, you'll start to see things like the fort, the vallum. The reason for raising that is the wall is not just a wall, it is a story of defense in depth and fortifications in depth. Okay, various Roman forts, because when Roman soldiers were building the wall, they had to live somewhere. So what you've got is various camps and bits and pieces knocking around to the north, south, east, west, all along the wall. You then have the Stangate Military Road, which Agricola built. And then Sycamore Gap and Marcastle 39. They're all written down there, you can see them. And actually what you can see to where the visitor centre is here, you'll see that there are some what are called tumuli. Now they are burial mounds, about 3,500 years old. And what that indicates is the nature of the land has been lived in for many, many thousands of years, and the Romans were just split the landscape, even though they were there for 400 years. So there's a whole pile of things there that are on these kinds of maps once you get the hang of being able to use them. And the L43 is only about 10 quid. Well worth it. There is just so much. Again, it's a matter of, as you are walking the wall, you get your map out, get a compass out and read it and look at it and orientate your map, then you can start to see things that you would miss otherwise. Again, it's a matter of having walked the wall, people get nagged and they don't want to make any notice and they have a little chunter to themselves and all the rest of it. But one of the key things for me is that people stop, take a breather and look around. Certainly when you are around the area of the Windsill, which is off to the east here, and when you get off onto the way towards Carraborough. The views are things that are there if you choose to look, and you need to train your eye. Just add more to the richness of the story, and as far as I'm concerned, the richness of the experience. Okay, a little bit about playing cards. I'm a little bit over time. My apologies.
Yeah, I think we
They
have
have
about 5 more minutes.
Okay, no worries. They had a standard design. Okay, it's the playing card shape. The Vicus would have been out to the south. This south gate, this is the north gate. All of these buildings inside the fort are part of my tour. It's the playing card shape, narrow walls, long walls. But the playing card shape was a standard design, but geography and geology would change the way forts were actually laid out. And an example of that is Epiarchum, not far from Housesteads as it happens. But that's lozenge shaped as you look at it, and that's because of the hill it was on and what have you. So we had the standard design, the same kind of central command and management buildings are in the center, It's just the land drove the shape of the fort. The plans, they had doctrine coming out the yin yang. And there are a number of books and people and authors. If you look on the links here, then get to Vegetius and Frontinus. Again, one of his other things was he wrote an army staff manual about how to run and fight battles. Again, you can get a copy, you get everything on Amazon now. There's a copy there if you're feeling really sad and you want to go and read it. The thing to take note of is that each of these books were written in different periods, and what you've got to do is take them as a composite, and if you like, um, not do your own do your own interpretation. But if you take one, you miss out of so much else that the other guys have written about because they all had different perspectives and different views. And there is a legionary fort, a book called De Unibus Castorum, written by a guy called Hyginus in principle. But all of the buildings and places that are there are in Housesteads and what have you. This is for a 3-legion fort, and there is some debate about whether anyone actually built something that big. Housesteads is 5 acres. A full legion fort would be anything from 15 to 20 acres. But all of that kind of thing are laid out as a standard plan. And that's it. As
Excellent.
a quick introduction.
Yeah, that was a lot of good information. I don't know if anyone has any questions, they can type them in the comments. If you're watching this on replay, then you can also type in questions in the comments and I'll be sure to tag Alan so he can answer them. Or you can save them for our next session, which then we're going to go start with the outside of the fort and then actually go into a little bit of detail about the actual structures and life inside the fort. Right, Alan?
Yep, that's about the size of it. Again, it's a matter of when I do the tours will be between an hour and a half and 2 hours. And the reason that the longer it takes is down to the fact that people ask questions. And unfortunately, some of the questions they ask, especially kids, God knows where they get it from. But the kids must, when they're coming up here, they must be getting their little books out, scribbling down and saying, I know, I'm going to have him. Um,
Yeah, and I
but
guess the thing I was going to say is I don't want anyone to feel bad about asking any questions because we know that, a lot of you have not yet visited Hadrian's Wall. So you won't know a lot of this stuff. And especially being an American, I know we have, there's other Americans in the group and they don't learn much about this in history. So feel free to ask whatever questions. I'm getting a couple comments about how interesting it was. And thank you, Alan. It was so informative. So I think what I'll do is I'll circle back with Alan on times that we can do the next session, and then I might see if we can do a poll because I know, it's so hard to find a time that works for everybody when we have a group that's so international, but we'll see what is going to work the best for the most people for our next session because I think that's going to be quite exciting because the fort really is something quite special, and just to get the expert insight from Alan is going to be really nice for those of you who are going to be doing the walk or those who visited and didn't really have enough time to see everything.
and
Um,
if I may, just for me,
yes.
please ask questions because what it does, if you ask questions, I sit there and I go, hang on a minute, it means I go and find something to research. So the next time someone asks, it sound I'm a bit cleverer than I am. So please ask questions. It's important to me as a guide.
Okay. Yes. So next time, guys, let's try to ask a few more questions. Thanks again for you guys that were able to join. And thanks again so much, Alan. I know you put a lot of time into not just putting together the presentation, but all the research that you've done as well. So I really appreciate that you've done this.
Okay.
Okay,
It's been my pleasure. I love this.
great. Thank you.
All right. Take care. Okay.
Yep.
Good.